Welcome back to another great episode of the Golden Knowledge Podcast, everyone. I'm your host, Pat Foss. I'm coming to you every single Friday with a brand new episode, so stay tuned and don't forget to hit subscribe and hit the notification bell for all new content that I produce every single week. My interview guest today is a fantastic interview guest. He is an author, a songwriter, and pianist. He is also the co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. It's Dan Barker. Dan, how are you?
Hi, Pat. Good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you as well, sir. I wanted to start off today kind of leading a little bit through your story, if we can. So I know originally you were religious and now you are not, of course, and you're co-president of Freedom from Religion Foundation. So how did that transition happen? And I'll go ahead and mute for you.
So the long story you can read in my book, Godless, How an Evangelical Preacher Became One of America's Leading Atheists. The short story is that I did preach for 19 years. I was an evangelical, born again, waiting for the second coming of Jesus. And I was a Christian songwriter, missionary to Mexico for a couple of years, an associate pastor of 3 different churches in California, cross-country evangelist. And I really, truly believed it all. I was expecting that maybe there would be one more day before Jesus came back and we could win more souls to the kingdom. And I believed the Bible was literally true. And I was not political. I just really wanted to save souls, to get out there and just preach the gospel. And after about maybe 15, 16 years or so of that, I started thinking. I didn't have doubts, but I started to have questions. And within Christianity, of course, there's a lot of variety. There's a whole continuum of Christian views. And so a lot of Christians have questions that are not necessarily doubts. It's just that your theology might change within the faith. So that's what happened to me. I started off way over here on the right side and gradually moved as I started thinking about Adam and Eve and evolution and the morality of the Bible and so on, until more of a moderate for a while. It took about 4 or 5 years, and I finally moved clear across that Christian spectrum, became one of these more liberal type believers, until finally I popped all the way out. And the phrase I like to use is that I threw out all the bathwater and I found out, hey, there's no baby there. It's just all evaporated. There's no good evidence for a God. The reliability of the Bible really is suspect. And that shocked me because I thought the Bible was it, the Bible, the Word of God, that's what guides our lives. And discovering that not only are there many internal contradictions, but also it's unhistorical in many places, unscientific, and immoral. Many of the teachings in the Bible, I thought, wow, I used to preach this. And I wrote a whole book about this a few years ago called God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction. But anyway, this was in the early 1980s. In 1983, I realized I was preaching still, and I was also recording Christian music for a lot of Christian artists in Southern California. I realized I don't believe anymore. This is, my definition of God had so changed until finally I, kind of like Tillich, Paul Tillich said, God is the ground of all being. Like it wasn't even a person anymore. Until I finally said, well, I guess I don't even believe in a God. If God's defined as a personal being and I don't believe that, what am I? And I didn't want to be an atheist. I didn't think that was something that anyone would choose to be. But by definition, in the summer of '83, I said, yep, I guess I don't believe anymore. I guess that makes me an atheist. That's weird. I kept preaching for a few more months, and then I finally broke it off in December of that year. And the next month, I wrote a letter to everybody, all my relatives and friends and co-missionaries and Christian publishers and everybody I could think of, saying, I don't believe anymore. It's just short, a one-page letter. And after that, then I joined the Freedom from Religion Foundation right away. And the rest is history.
I'm curious, though, the transition after you realized you were an atheist and after you had written that letter, and you said shortly after you joined the FFRF. I'm wondering, why was it right from joining or leaving, the church to joining the FFRF? Was it that you felt almost that you needed to latch onto something else, or was it because you felt that you needed to help other people understand kind of the conclusion that you'd come to? I'm not sure.
Well, I didn't really want to join anything. I just wanted to live my life. And I finally got a job as a computer programmer for a while, doing assembly language programming, real-time multitasking, eventually for the railroads. That was fun. But I was reading. I was hungry. I wanted to know. And of course, back then, there was no internet. The only way to learn something was to go to the library or buy a book. And so I was getting magazines, and I saw an ad for a book that said, "Woe to the women, the Bible tells me so." And I thought, that sounds interesting. So I mailed it off. Remember envelopes and stamps, I mailed it off, and they sent me this book about the Bible and women, written by a young woman named Annie Laurie Gaylor. And I thought, this is great. So I wrote her a letter. I said, "Thanks for writing this. By the way, I'm an ex-minister." And she never answered it, but her mother answered it. Her mother, Ann Gaylor, and Annie Laurie Gaylor had co-founded the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And so Ann wrote me back and said, "You must have a good story. Can you write an article for our newspaper?" And I thought, well, okay. So I wrote an article about my story called "Losing Faith in Faith." And then a few months later, I got a call from a producer of a TV show in Chicago called AM Chicago. It was on in the mornings. And I had never heard of this young host. Her name was Oprah Winfrey. And they were doing a show about atheism with Ann and Annie Laurie, and they asked them, "Do you know anybody who used to be a believer, who now is an atheist?" And they said, "Well, we just got a letter from a guy in California." So they flew me to Chicago. That was September of '84, and I had been preaching 9 months earlier. And so for the first time in my life, I actually was speaking about my atheism. Because when you're a minister and you leave the pulpit, then what do you do? Where's your audience, And so I had never actually said these things to anybody. And here I was on live TV with Oprah Winfrey. And it was the first time I had knowingly met any other atheists. I met Ann and Annie Laurie on that show, on that day of that show. So that was fun. And the audience was really hostile. And I thought that was great. It was great TV, and you can see that show, by the way. If you will Google Oprah Barker, something like that, and Gaylor, you can actually see that show. Somebody grabbed a recording of it. So I guess I kind of enjoyed it, and so I thought, well, I'm gonna keep working with this group, and I still am.
I know, sorry about that. I know during your time giving speeches or lectures or teaming up with people to give like an intelligence squared debate, right? I'm a huge fan of that for you. And I'm wondering, how does that come about? Is that because of your work with FFRF? Is it just your work going to different either conventions or giving different lectures where you're teaching about, a married bachelor that cannot exist, and that's how you're trying to frame this God figure, or certain God figures with certain characteristics, of course. I'm curious, how do those come about? The intelligence square debates, and how do you start building, I hate to say it like this, but how do you start building your profile as an atheist lecturer?
So it's by invitation. For example, on that Oprah show, one of the audience members said something about, "Why do you feel the need to go on TV and espouse your atheist views?" And Ann said, "Well, we were invited. Oprah invited us to this. It wasn't like we're barging into your churches, or it's not like we're trying to go out and convert everybody, knocking on doors." So we have never set up any debates at FFRF, but there are student groups and universities and other organizations that want to have a debate, so they're looking for an opponent. So I get invited to do these debates. And as of next March the 4th, I'll be doing a debate in Florida, in Orlando. That'll be my 138th actual public moderated time debates before an audience. I've done dozens and dozens and dozens of informal debates like radio and TV and that, but I'll be an actual stand-up debate with an opponent. That'll be number 138. And that sounds like a lot, but that's since 1985, February of 85. So what is that? 37 years. So it's about 4 a year.
But still, 4 a year. That's still, obviously by your standards as a formal debate goes, it's probably not a lot to yourself, but yeah, 138 to anyone else, even myself or some of my friends that are either newly atheist or have been an atheist for a while. I would say to you or ask you this. When you say atheist, what does that mean to you? When you say I'm an atheist or you identify as such, what does that mean to you, even definitionally?
So the word atheist with a lowercase a, it's not a label, it's just a description. We could say every baby's an atheist because theism is a belief in God. A theist is a person who has a belief in a personal God, unlike a deist or deist who has a belief in an impersonal God. So if you don't have that belief in a personal God, you are by definition atheistic. The word a doesn't mean anti or opposed. There are some anti-theists in the world. And I might call myself an anti-theist depending on which definition of God you're bringing forth. So atheism isn't anything at all. It's nothing positive. It's just the absence of a belief. It'd be like somebody said, well, atheism is a religion. And I say, well, if atheism is a religion, then baldness is a hair color. It's the absence of it. It's not something you're promoting. However, within that group of atheists, there's a small subset of what you might call capital A, who not only lack a belief or are people without a belief, they actually do say that they believe there's no God. You would call them maybe capital A or positive atheists. They're actually saying they have a belief that there's no God. So if you define God a certain way, like if you define the God as the God of the Bible, then I am a capital A atheist regarding that particular God. Not only do I not believe in that God, I claim to know that that God doesn't exist. And I think in the minds of most people in the public, that's what they think an atheist is a denier. And atheism is not denying anything. It's just simply not asserting. It's not saying yes or no. And it's similar to agnosticism, really, except agnosticism deals with what you claim to know, whereas atheism deals with what you claim to believe. They're two totally different things, and you can be both.
So as you were talking about that, though, and you said that in that subset of lowercase a atheist, which would be someone who says they purely just lack a belief in said God or God's concept, whatever that may be. Then you say the capital A, and that would be more so, well, how you and I would view, let's say, the Abraham or the God of the Bible. That's how you and I would view that God figure. But I'm wondering with like the Graham Oppies of the world, when he says, basically comes out and says, to me, you're only an atheist if. Does that, when he says you're only an atheist if, or he thinks that atheists should only call themselves atheists if they're making a positive claim that God or gods do not exist, is that kind of sowing some kind of like headbutting almost in a community, or is it okay for these outliers to still happen where someone can say so assertively that you're not an atheist, almost like a no true Scotsman fallacy? You're not an atheist unless.
Well, I think Graham is really referring to the capital A, a person who would use it as a label. If you're going to call yourself an atheist and wear an A pin or something, then in that case, yeah, you need to make some kind of positive arguments. And of course, you have to decide and define which God it is you're not believing in. So, there's tens of millions of people in this country alone who don't believe in a God, but they wouldn't call themselves an atheist. They're simply atheistic in the lowercase a sense. It might be, maybe this is a bad analogy, but it might be like me. I'm assuming you and I are both male. And that's true. It's a description of what we are. But I don't think we would want to go the step further and say we're both capital M males. I am a male, and wear a big M on our shirt. Say, I am a male. That's what defines me. So yeah, you can look at atheism different ways. You can look at it as a description, or you can look at it as an identity or a label. And I think Graham Oppie would be correct in the case of the uppercase atheist. Yeah, if you're going to say you're an atheist and wear it as a badge, well, then you better have some arguments and you better make some claims here.
So I'm wondering, as far as the God of the Bible that you were saying that you and I are in agreement on, that we would say we're probably a capital A atheist about. saying that we would make claims, a positive claim that God does not exist, or that we're convinced it does not exist. How do you reach that? How do you read? And I don't want to give away your books. Obviously, I want people to still read your books as well, because I'm going to be putting the links to those in the description of the YouTube video. But if you can give us sort of a summary of why you are convinced that there is no God of the Bible.
So, yeah, and to keep it simple, the God of the Bible is pretty much defined as a certain type of being. And there's some people call him the omni God. That's what John Loftus calls him. He has at least these three omni characteristics. He's omniscient, he's omnipotent, and he's omnibenevolent. He's all three of those things. That's the God I used to believe in, the God I used to preach. And yet those three omnis cannot exist together. They contradict each other. It's like what you said earlier. It's like saying, I believe in the existence of a married bachelor. A being cannot be all three of those things at once. It could be two of those things. If you get rid of omnibenevolence, you could have an all-knowing, all-powerful God, but he's a jerk, right? Or you could get rid of the all-powerful. You could have an omnibenevolent and omniscient God, but he can't do much about it, about evil in the world, for example. So there's different combinations, and there's different theologians who try to tinker with those definitions. But the God of the Bible is defined with all three of those characteristics. For example, one of my arguments is called FANG, F-A-N-G, the free will argument for the non-existence of God. If God's a person, and if a person has freedom, has free will, regardless of what you think about humans having free will, and there's debate about that, even atheists disagree on that, regardless of what you think about that, at least theists believe that God has free will, right? So God, and if he's omniscient, he knows the future, he knows the past, he knows the present. And in order to have free will, in order to be a personal being with free will who makes decisions, freely makes decisions, you cannot know the future. If you know the future, you don't have that freedom to change your mind in what we would call libertarian free will, which many theists believe we have. I don't know about Calvinists. Calvinists probably don't, but and there's probably different flavors of Calvinism. So a being who knows the future is fixed. So if God knows what he's going to do tomorrow at 12 noon, well, then he has no power or freedom to change what he's going to do between now and then. There's no period of indeterminacy. So we can say by that definition, if God is a being with free will, a personal being with free will, and he knows the future, then he cannot exist. He not only doesn't exist, he cannot exist by definition. It's one of the mutually incompatible properties. There are many other arguments too, the mutually incompatible properties that you put together into one being. There are many other ways to show that being doesn't exist. So besides that, there are other explanations for the existence of the belief in the God of the Bible besides him actually existing. We know that he seems to have been cut from the same fabric as other ancient pagan mythologies of the time. Yahweh apparently was the son of Elyon, and Yahweh was probably married, based on whichever ancient Semitic or Canaanite or Syrian myth you want to believe. So we can see that God came from the same kind of belief system as other gods, and we don't believe in them. So it's pretty easy to dismiss the God of the Bible as a human creation.
And what about what Dr. Shermer says about type 1 mental errors in cognition, and early on, the early Homo sapiens on the plains of Africa making connections where there might not be a connection in order to survive and procreate, like a brush in the bush next to you, and you assuming it's a dangerous predator to survive. And if you don't do that, that's a type 2 mental error, which means you're lunch and you're dead. Is that also a possibility that you're considering for why humans may give agency to what they call God figures, or something maybe they can't explain? So why not stick this in here?
Well, yes and no. That explanation goes a long way toward the belief. Why do we have a belief? It doesn't. If you can explain a belief in naturalistic terms, it doesn't mean that what you believe in therefore doesn't exist anymore. Some people call that hyperactive agency detector. You're better off assuming that the noise in the grass next to you is a predator rather than just the wind blowing. Because if you make that mistake, you're not gonna survive to pass on your offspring. And so we inherited. I think this does go a long way toward explaining why we believe. It doesn't disprove a God, but why we would believe. And by the way, that doesn't necessarily address the Christian or the Judeo-Christian God, because that argument could apply to any deity, and not just deities, magical forces and ghosts and other supernatural beings as well.
Well, and that's kind of where I was going with that. I mean, not just with the God of the Bible, but in God figures and, like you said, magical thinking. I think that goes a long way to show one way in which humans could have developed this magical thinking very easily.
That's just one. Yeah, that's one hypothesis. Let's put it that way.
Sure.
There are many others. Imagination is another one, and instincts. The instinct to worship a king and a lord and a master was most probably forced upon us by the lords and the masters, only allowing those who would submit to be the ones who would breed, and those who did. So that could have been bred into us as an instinct as well.
And what do you think for people that are newly being atheistic or kind of dabbling in or out of their given religion? I know a lot of people, like there is a gentleman that I talked to online that said, hey, I host an Ask an Atheist room on an app called Clubhouse. And I had a gentleman who was from a mostly Muslim country who was saying, yes, I'm also an atheist, but I'm afraid to say anything because if I can't get out of this area, my family may even turn me in to have me killed because I'm not following the faith of the culture. Is there a way to, or do we have certain ways to help people like that get out of these cultures that are going to be detrimental to their well-being, or are we working on such foundations?
Well, some of our groups are trying to help some of those people, but we can't do it all. And there's thousands and thousands and thousands. So any one of those cases, we had a group called Non-Belief Relief that was helping people to leave the country that was persecuting them and get their family out. And each one of those is expensive and time consuming, and they have to be vetted. We have to make sure they're the real thing. And so that has been done. The Humanists of UK have a program to help people as well. And so, and FFRF also, but maybe during the year we could help 5 or 12 people, but there's thousands who need help like that. So I think it's probably, it's not just in some Muslim country. It could be the community knew that business owner was an atheist. You know what I mean? So sometimes for the sake of your family, you do have to kind of, every situation is different. I would not advocate that everybody has to be an outspoken, aggressive atheist. I think most atheists and agnostics in the country are just pretty much quiet and live and let live, and they just don't believe. And I'm not going to dictate to them that they have to come out of the closet and make atheism strong in the world. Each one of us has to think for ourselves.
And just so you know, the last portion of what you said, and I can go into editing as well for this because it is pre-recorded, your video feed jumped out with your audio for at least 10 to 15 seconds. So what I will say is, if you can just say about helping, there's so many people to help out there, and you can only help about 5 to 12 people, in a year. If you can just kind of restate that for me, and then I can move on from there to asking where your social media is at.
So there are many groups like ours who do try to help some of these people who need to get out of a dangerous situation. And we've raised some money, and we've actually successfully got people out of a country, maybe into Canada or to the US, and help them get on their feet. But that might be 6 or 8 or 12 people a year that we can do that for. And there's thousands of people that need help.
And I'm so glad that you're at least trying to help. I know it's very few people, like by the mass, a number of people that should be helped or should be able to have help. But of course, like you said, we can't do it all. So before we wrap up today, where can people find you on social media if they like to get in contact with you, or if they have a debate on Ledger for you? How would they get a hold of you?
Well, of course, our webpage is the main source. It's ffrf.org, and there's everything there you would want, all sorts of resources, including state church separation. If you want to make a complaint, a legal complaint about a violation of state church separation, we have products and literature and books, and we have FAQs. We have music. We even have a Spanish page. If you si hablas español, puede visitar nuestra página en español. And so we also, and then of course on Facebook, we have 4FFRF, the number 4. And most weeks we have, it's called Ask an Atheist on Facebook Live, where you can actually tune in and ask questions in real time. It's usually at noon Central. And of course you can look us on Twitter. And on, I don't know if our social media person has an Instagram for us, but we should be doing that too.
I appreciate it so much. And thank you so much for coming on today's show. I had a great time, a wonderful time interviewing you today. Today, my guest was author, singer, pianist, co-president of FFRF, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, Dan Barker. Dan, thank you so much.
Thank you, Pat.
I've been your host, Pat Voss of the Golden Knowledge Podcast, and I'll see you in the next interview.